For 15 years, he was the ghost that haunted Rome's sleep. He was the man who made the Senate tremble and the mothers of Italy weep. At Cannae, Hannibal Barca slaughtered 70,000 Romans in a single afternoon, turning a green field red with the blood of an entire generation. He had brought the greatest power of the Mediterranean to its knees, not with brute force, but with a mind sharper than any gladius. But on this hot, dusty morning in October 202 BC, Hannibal did not look across the plains of Zama with the confidence of a conqueror. He looked with the dread of a man who recognizes his own reflection. Standing against him was not another incompetent consul or a terrified militia. Across the dry heat of North Africa stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, the only Roman who had survived the slaughter, studied the butchery, and learned exactly how to replicate it. The master of traps was about to walk into a snare designed by his best student. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we do not just recount a fight. We witness the funeral of one empire and the violent birth of another. This is the Battle of Zama. This confrontation was the judgment day of the Second Punic War. For nearly 2 decades, Rome and Carthage had bled each other dry in a struggle for total dominance over the Western world. Now, it all came down to this single day, on a flat plain south of Carthage. The stakes were absolute. If Hannibal won, Rome would face extinction. If Scipio won, Carthage would be reduced to dust and memory. But the outcome was not decided by courage alone. It was decided by a cold, mathematical reversal of fortune. We will analyze how Scipio neutralized the most terrifying weapon of antiquity, the war elephant. Not with walls, but with open space. We will see how the Roman legions, famous for their rigid discipline, executed a dance of flexibility that baffled their enemies. And we will discover how the very tactic that Hannibal used to destroy Rome was turned against him to seal his doom. To understand the butchery at Zama, we must first understand the gamble that made it possible. For over a decade, Rome had fought a defensive war, reacting in terror to every move Hannibal made on Italian soil. But Publius Cornelius Scipio was different. He understood that you cannot kill a beast by cutting off its claws. You must strike at its heart. Against the furious protests of the conservative Roman Senate, who feared leaving their city undefended, Scipio took the legions across the sea to North Africa in 204 BC. He did not go to fight. He went to burn. He ravaged the Carthaginian countryside, torching estates and capturing supply lines, until the wealthy Council of Carthage screamed in panic. They sent an urgent message to Hannibal in Italy to come home, or there would be no home left to save. The lion was forced to leave his hunting ground. History rarely records the bitterness of that moment. Hannibal had spent 15 years bleeding Rome on its own territory, undefeated in major battle. Yet, he was recalled not as a conqueror, but as a desperate fireman. As he prepared to depart Italy, the general committed an act of cold necessity that revealed the grim nature of this war. He ordered the slaughter of thousands of his own horses that he could not transport across the sea. He would not leave a single beast for the Romans to use. He sailed for Africa, leaving behind a legacy of terror. But he arrived to find a strategic nightmare. The battlefield of Zama presented a fatal problem for the Carthaginian commander. The terrain of North Africa is not the rugged, mountainous landscape of Italy where Hannibal had pulled off his greatest ambushes. It is a land of vast, flat, and open plains. There are no narrow passes to hide an army, no foggy lakes to trap an unwary consul. In this unforgiving arena, there is nowhere to hide. On this flat ground, the army, with superior cavalry, dictates the flow of battle. This was the cruel irony of 202 BC. For years, Hannibal had decimated Roman legions using his superior Numidian horsemen. But now, through diplomacy and charisma, Scipio had won the loyalty of the Numidian prince Massinissa. The finest cavalry in the world had switched sides. The board had flipped. Hannibal was now the one fighting on open ground, exposed and blind, while Scipio held the reins of the very weapon that had once slaughtered his countrymen. On the morning of the battle, two armies stood mirroring each other, representing not just two nations, but two conflicting philosophies of war. Hannibal Barca fielded a force of approximately 40,000 infantry, but numbers in history can be deceiving. This was not the sleek, lethal machine that had crossed the Alps. It was a patchwork monster, stitched together from desperation. His first line consisted of mercenaries, Ligurians, Gauls, and Balearic slingers, men who fought for gold, not glory. Behind them stood the citizen levies of Carthage, terrified and inexperienced. Only in the third line, held far in the rear as a strategic reserve, did Hannibal place his true strength. The grizzled veterans of the Italian campaign. These men had not seen defeat in 15 years, and their loyalty was to Hannibal, not Carthage. But the general's true hope lay not in men, but in monsters. At the very front of his formation, 80 war elephants stamped the ground. These were not merely animals. They were living siege engines, designed to shatter the Roman morale before the first sword was even drawn. Opposite them, Scipio Africanus commanded a force of roughly 35,000 men. His infantry was smaller, but it possessed a terrifying unity. These were not mercenaries. They were survivors of Cannae and veterans of the Spanish Wars, men who had been drilled to function as a single organism. But the decisive weight on the scale was not the legion. It was the horse. On the wings of the Roman army sat 4,000 Numidian cavalrymen led by Prince Massinissa, alongside 2,700 Roman equites. Scipio held the winning hand. He possessed superior mobility on the very terrain that demanded it. Before the slaughter began, history provides us with a moment of silence, so profound it feels almost theatrical. The two greatest generals of their age rode out to meet each other in the empty space between the lines. It is the only recorded meeting between Hannibal and Scipio. They were alone, save for their interpreters.
I know what they say about
The old lion, whose beard was now gray, looked into the eyes of the young wolf who had studied his every move. Hannibal, perhaps sensing the fragility of his position, spoke of the fickleness of fortune. He offered terms. Carthage would give up all claims to overseas territories if Rome left Africa alone. It was a plea for survival, disguised as a negotiation. Scipio listened, but his answer was cold iron. He reminded Hannibal that it was Carthage who had broken the truce, Carthage who had started the war, and Carthage who was now trembling. There would be no negotiated peace. there would be unconditional surrender or total destruction. The time for words had passed. The gods had already placed the dice in the cup. The two commanders parted ways without a handshake. As they rode back to their lines, the silence broke. The trumpets of Zama sounded, and 80 elephants began their charge. The negotiation was over. The execution was about to begin. The ground began to tremble before the sound reached the Roman lines. At a signal from Hannibal, 80 war elephants, the largest number he had ever fielded in a single engagement, surged forward. In the ancient world, an elephant charge was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was a weapon of psychological devastation. These were living siege towers, armored and intoxicated with fermented wine to heighten their aggression, designed to smash through the rigid lines of infantry like a hammer through glass. For the average Roman soldier, the sight of these gray leviathans emerging from the dust cloud was a vision of primal terror. Hannibal was banking everything on this initial shock. He needed to break the Roman cohesion immediately, to trample Scipio's discipline into the dust before tactics could even come into play. But Scipio Africanus had spent years deconstructing the Carthaginian way of war. He knew that an elephant, for all its size, is an animal governed by instinct, not a machine programmed for destruction. It will always seek the path of least resistance. To exploit this, Scipio did something that defied centuries of Roman military doctrine. The standard Roman formation, the quincunx, resembled a checkerboard designed to cover gaps and present a continuous front. On this day, Scipio ordered his maniples to stand in perfect vertical columns, one behind the other. From a distance, the line looked solid, but up close, it was a series of open lanes, broad, straight avenues running directly through the Roman army, filled only with light skirmishers known as velites. As the gray wall of beasts thundered closer, the trap was sprung. The Roman velites did not just throw javelins. They launched a sonic assault. Trumpets blared, horns screamed, and thousands of men beat their shields in a cacophony of orchestrated chaos. The sudden wall of noise, combined with the stinging pain of darts aimed at sensitive eyes and trunks, sent the animals into a panic. Confronted with a choice between a wall of shouting men with spears and the open, empty lanes Scipio had prepared, the elephants instinctively chose the empty space. The result was a masterpiece of tactical engineering. The great beasts thundered harmlessly down the corridors Scipio had left open, passing through the Roman army without breaking a single formation. It was a matador's dodge on the scale of an army. The legionaries on the sides simply rained missiles down on the passing flanks of the animals, turning the terrifying charge into a gauntlet of death. However, not all the elephants ran through. On the wings, the noise and pain drove many of the beasts into a frenzy of fear. Instead of charging the enemy, they turned back, stampeding directly into the ranks of their own army. This was the disaster Hannibal had feared. The panicked elephants smashed into the Carthaginian cavalry stationed on the left flank, throwing the horses into wild confusion. The Roman cavalry commander, Laelius, seized the moment instantly, charging into the disorganized mass. In minutes, what was supposed to be Hannibal's opening hammer blow had recoiled to shatter his own protection. The elephants were gone, the cavalry was engaging, and now the battlefield was stripped bare for the brutal, grinding work of the infantry. With the elephants scattered and the cavalry chasing each other off the horizon, the battlefield fell into a momentary, suffocating lull. The dust settled to reveal the true horror of Hannibal's design. He had arranged his infantry not as a solid block, but in three distinct, isolated lines, separated by significant distance. This was not a formation of support. It was a machine of attrition. The first line was composed of 12,000 mercenaries, Ligurians, Gauls, and Moors, men who fought for coin. The second line held the citizen levies of Carthage and Libyan Phoenicians, and far to the rear, standing like statues in the shimmering heat, waited the veterans of Italy. Hannibal's plan was a cynical masterpiece. He would feed the first two lines to the Roman wolf, letting Scipio's legions dull their swords on 20,000 expendable bodies before they ever reached his true army. The Roman hastati, the front rank of Scipio's legion, advanced. They slammed into the mercenary line with the mechanical efficiency that had conquered half the Mediterranean. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. The mercenaries, realizing they had no retreat, fought with the desperation of trapped animals. But they were individuals fighting a system. The Roman shield wall pulsed forward, a rhythmic engine of stabbing steel, slowly grinding the mercenaries into the sand. As the mercenary line began to buckle and break, the survivors turned to flee back toward the safety of the Carthaginian second line. It was here that the battle descended into madness. As the bleeding mercenaries ran back, they expected their Carthaginian paymasters to open the ranks and let them through. But the second line did not move. Hannibal had given strict orders. The formation must not be broken by fleeing cowards. The Carthaginians leveled their spears not at the Romans, but at their own retreating allies. Betrayed and trapped between the advancing Roman wall and the immovable Carthaginian line, the mercenaries went berserk. They began to hack at the Carthaginians to force a path, while the Carthaginians killed them to maintain their order. Scipio's men watched in grim amazement as the enemy army began to tear itself apart. But this chaos was also a trap. The Romans now had to step over mounds of slippery, entangled corpses to engage the second line. The hastati, their arms heavy from slaughter, now faced a fresh wave of Carthaginian citizens. The grinding process repeated. The Romans pushed, the Carthaginians held, and the heat of the African sun beat down on armor like a blacksmith's hammer. Slowly, inexorably, the second line too was shattered. As the survivors fled, they diverted around the flanks of the third line, because they knew the veterans standing there would not let them pass. Now, the field was covered in the dead. The Roman legionaries, gasping for breath, their shields heavy with arrows and their pila spent, looked up. Through the haze of heat and dust, they saw the final nightmare. The third line had not moved a single step. Hannibal's old guard, the men who had annihilated Roman armies at Cannae and Trebia, stood fresh, rested, and waiting. The meat grinder had done its work. Scipio's men were exhausted, and the real battle had only just begun. What happened next was a tactical anomaly that displayed the supreme discipline of the Roman army. In the middle of a battlefield slick with blood and piled high with the bodies of the first two lines, Scipio Africanus ordered a halt. He realized that charging directly into Hannibal's fresh veterans with his own disorganized and exhausted troops would be suicide. Amidst the screams of the dying and the suffocating dust, the Roman trumpets sounded a complex series of commands. Incredibly, the legionaries stopped fighting, stepped back, and began to reform. Scipio dismantled the traditional deep formation of the triarii and extended his army into a single, long, thin line. He was sacrificing depth for width, ensuring that Hannibal's larger force could not outflank him. It was a gamble of the highest order, a wall of shields with no reserves behind it. Then, the pause ended. The two lines surged forward and collided with a sound like a thunderclap. This was no longer a battle of maneuvers or tricks. It was a duel of pure lethality between the two finest heavy infantry forces on Earth. On one side were Scipio's men, the conquerors of Spain, hardened by years of campaigning. On the other were Hannibal's old guard, the ghosts of Italy. These were men who had crossed the Alps, who had stood knee-deep in Roman blood at Cannae, and who worshipped Hannibal as a god of war. They were fresh, rested, and fighting with the terrifying knowledge that if they lost here, their city would die. The combat was intimate and horrific. There was no room for javelins or arrows. This was the work of the gladius and the short spear. The two lines locked together in a heaving, grinding stalemate. For the first time in the battle, the momentum began to shift visibly against Rome. Scipio's men were fighting on lungs burned by the heat and arms heavy from hours of slaughtering the first two lines. Hannibal's veterans were fresh, striking with brutal precision against the tired Roman shields. The Roman line began to bend. It did not break, but it was thinning. Foot by foot, the Carthaginians were pushing the legions backward. Scipio rode behind his men, shouting, rallying, trying to hold the dam against the rising flood. But he knew the mathematical reality. In a war of attrition, the exhausted man dies first. The genius of Rome was staring defeat in the face. He needed a miracle, and he needed it now, or the bones of his legions would bleach in the African sun alongside the thousands of others Hannibal had slain. Just as the Roman line was beginning to fracture under the relentless pressure of Hannibal's veterans, the horizon behind the Carthaginian army began to darken. It was not a storm, but a cloud of dust raised by thousands of hooves. For a fleeting moment, Hannibal might have hoped it was his own scattered horsemen returning to the fray. But as the figures emerged from the haze, the grim reality became clear. It was Massinissa and Laelius. The Roman and Numidian cavalry had not merely chased their enemies off the map. They had maintained their discipline, rallied their squadrons, and executed a wide arc to return to the center of the battle. They arrived not a moment too soon, and they arrived with the force of a falling guillotine. With a deafening crash, the combined cavalry force slammed into the exposed rear of Hannibal's veteran line. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The old guard, which had been immovably pushing the Romans back just moments before, now found itself trapped in the very nightmare Hannibal had invented. It was the perfect encirclement. It was a mirror image of Cannae, but this time, the architect of that slaughter was the one trapped inside the killing zone. The Carthaginian veterans, forced to fight Scipio's infantry to their front and the Numidian spears to their back, lost their cohesion, The formation did not just break, it evaporated. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse of mathematical precision. The Romans, sensing the change in tide, found a second wind and surged forward. The encirclement turned into a methodical extermination. There was no escape for the Carthaginian army. The plains of Zama, which offered no cover, became a vast altar of sacrifice. By the time the sun began to set, nearly 20,000 Carthaginians lay dead, and another 20,000 were taken prisoner. The army of Carthage had ceased to exist. In the midst of this total collapse, a singular, tragic figure was seen fleeing the field. Hannibal Barca, the man who had sworn an oath of eternal hatred against Rome, the general who had never lost a major battle in Italy, was forced to ride for his life. He escaped with a small handful of horsemen, riding hard for the coastal city of Hadrumatum. He left behind him the ruins of his city's future. The invincibility of Hannibal had been broken, not by brute strength, but by a Roman who had learned his lessons too well. The student had not only defeated the master, he had used the master's own brilliance to destroy him. The dust of Zama settled to reveal a new world order. Carthage, once the queen of the trade routes, was broken. The peace treaty that followed was not a negotiation, but a sentence. Carthage was stripped of its empire, forced to burn its magnificent navy, save for 10 meager ships, and ordered to pay a crushing indemnity of 10,000 talents over 50 years. Most humiliating of all, the city was forbidden from waging war, even in self-defense, without Rome's permission. The great rival had been reduced to a defenseless client state, waiting for its final execution half a century later. For the victors, the rewards were immense. Publius Cornelius Scipio returned to Rome not just as a consul, but as a legend, earning the cognomen Africanus. Yet, history saved its final, cruelest irony for the two men who defined this era. Despite their brilliance, both Scipio and Hannibal would die in exile, betrayed by the very nations they had fought to save. Scipio, disgusted by Roman politics and accusations of corruption, left Rome, demanding that his bones not rest in his ungrateful country. Hannibal, hunted by Roman vengeance for decades, eventually took poison in a foreign fortress rather than surrender. The Battle of Zama was the true birth of the Roman Empire. It transformed Rome from a regional Italian power into the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The sea became Mare Nostrum, our sea. The legions had proven that they could conquer not just land, but the greatest military genius of the age. The Republic had won the world, but the influx of wealth and slave labor from these conquests would slowly rot its internal foundations, setting the stage for the Caesars. Rome had slain the monster outside its gates, only to breed new ones within. Subscribe to our channel to witness the rise of these new monsters and the relentless march of history.